Good afternoon. My name is Tim Lynch. I am your host on Legal Lines. Legal Lines is brought to you by the Massachusetts LGBTQ Bar Association. We're brought to you live the third Wednesday of every month at 4 p.m. If you'd like to join us, please do. Our number here is 617-708-3290. That's 617-708-3290. We have an interesting program here today. Our guest has been here before. Is Charles Lerner of Boston CASA. Hi, Charles.
Hello, Tim.
And Charles is going to discuss today issues surrounding foster children in the Commonwealth, focusing on what's happening up on Beacon Hill, and also discuss issues pertaining to the foster kids who are LGBTQ. So a lot of work here today, Charles. So why don't we first explain to the audience what CASA is?
Sure. So CASA has been around since the mid-1970s. It's a national organization, although all of the programs are run autonomously across the country. There's about 950 programs. It started in the 70s in Seattle with one juvenile court judge who had at the time, an out-of-the-box thinking idea where he felt that community citizens could step up and assist the court in making some really critical decisions on behalf of vulnerable children who had experienced abuse or neglect. So it started with one program in Seattle. Boston, our program started in 1982, became a fully autonomous nonprofit at the beginning of 2012. And really, our mission is to advocate for the best interests of children in foster care within the court system. These are children that are often invisible, overlooked. It's amazing that some of our community members are completely unaware of just how many kids are in the juvenile court system in foster care away from their families. In Massachusetts alone, we have about 8,000 children who are in the system in one way or another. And there was recently a report by the Office of the Child Advocate that showed that the abuse and neglect of children in the foster care system, which is a system that is designed to protect kids, the incidence of abuse and neglect is actually increasing. So that's what we're here for, is to more closely watch over these kids. So
before I dissect that, let me first, full disclosure.
Yeah, I thought you were going to get to that.
I have to give a full disclosure here. I actually was a volunteer in the CASA program back in the very early 90s. I was elected to the board of directors in 95, and in 2000 I was elected as president of Boston CASA and of the board of Boston CASA, and I am still president of the board of Boston CASA. So full disclosure of my involvement. And let's dissect that just a little bit, because the number of 8,000 is huge, right. and I can understand people being shocked by that, and that's just in Massachusetts.
Right.
And the report of the Child Welfare League was not very complimentary, and that was done after there was a lot of problems with the with the Department of Family and Child Services. Do you recall any specifics of the report other than it was the abuse of children in the system, in the foster care system, has been increasing over time?
Well, I think that the common themes are that our children in the system are not being as closely monitored as I think people think they are. So this idea that often in best case scenarios, a child will be visited by their Department of Children and Family social worker once a month. Now, keep in mind that when a child is in the custody of the state, we are, in effect, replacing parents with a state system.
A bureaucracy.
A bureaucracy. And the idea, hopefully, is that at their disposal, the Department of Children and Families can put place their confidence in foster parents, in group homes, in residential centers, and extended family members, et cetera, because clearly social workers for a few minutes, once a month can't adequately parent a child. Sure. The challenge is that where these children are placed, and this is only part of the system that we're talking about, We're not talking about the services that are provided to the parents of these children to hopefully reunify with their children. But these children are placed in a myriad of placements that are anywhere from, below marginal and unacceptable all the way to exceptional placements or homes where they're receiving very high quality of care. But
if you say below marginal, what do you mean?
Gosh, below marginal, I would say, and you and I have talked about this personally. I've said it on the show before, but I'm a previous foster youth. I was in 7 placements by the time I was 4. I'm the adoptive parent of a child who was in 8 placements by the time he was 4, and in my experience personally, but also professionally, is that, again, going back to what I cited earlier, that children are being abused by caregivers and in placements that they are placed in. And not only do they experience the trauma of experiencing abuse or neglect that led to them being removed from their homes, but they're being placed with sometimes strangers who are also abusing and neglecting them. And this could be severe physical abuse and neglect by caregivers. We've had cases where children have been, sexually abused or physically abused in their foster homes. We had a case that we worked on at CASA a couple years ago, where a youth was being locked in his bedroom at night by his foster parent, with perhaps the best of intentions. The foster parent was worried about him roaming around the house at night, but that's not an appropriate way of handling that. And these kids are really in a vulnerable position, and many of them are not the type of kids that are going to tell anybody. So,
Well, yeah, and I from my experience and from talking with some of the kids I was involved in as they grew up, number one, they don't like to tell,
yeah,
because they'll just get moved to another home.
That's right.
And if you get moved to another home, well, whatever friends you made in that neighborhood or that school,
right,
you get moved to another home, potentially a new school system. Well, you've lost your friends,
right.
And better the devil you know.
That's right.
Than the devil you don't know. And the one thing you said, and I experienced that in cases I've handled, the kids get moved around a lot.
Oh yeah.
And how anybody can expect a child to form a relationship, a meaningful relationship, when they're getting moved from home to home to home to home, it's just impossible.
Well, and then what ends up happening, having been a social worker in the field as well, I've been with CASA for almost 6 years now. I started in California and now here in Massachusetts, but prior to that I was a long-term social worker. And one of the things that I used to like to challenge people on, which I like to do, is I would sit at a team meeting and I would hear some of the comments that professionals would make about our teenagers, for example, and the things that they were doing, and kind of the pejorative statements made about our kids. And one of the things I used to like to say to even social workers and other folks at the table was, what do you expect? Okay. This makes complete sense that he's doing what he's doing, that he's keying cars and telling people to screw off, or running on the streets. It makes complete sense that he's doing that. We have let this kid down. When do we stop caring about these kids? Do we stop caring about them at 13, at 16? Often we stop caring about them at 18. And these are the people that end up incarcerated.
Yes.
Our kids in foster care are disproportionately incarcerated and homeless. And so these are the folks that we walk around when we see people sleeping on the streets or loitering on the streets, and these are the people that we give up on when they end up in our criminal justice system. And really, we are at fault. And that's one of the things that I think we need to really push the Commonwealth on, is that we need to intervene as quickly as possible and rally around these kids, because then when they end up in the criminal justice system and we're complaining about it, we're complicit in that happening. So. And that's what CASA, I think, is what we do is we match a child that's experienced abuse or neglect and is in this system with a community member that receives very comprehensive training and supervision by one of our staff members. And the idea is that if a child has one caring and consistent adult looking after them, it's clear that the outcomes are much better for those kids that have that support.
Yeah, I want to underscore a couple of things here. One is, I remember reading at the U.S. Department of Justice did a statistic that 95% of people in jail for violent crimes grew up in foster care. And going back to your point, that's almost understandable when you think about it's so easy for them. You know, they have a little fight with a foster parent. What teenager doesn't? Hello, with a parent, let alone a foster parent. And the foster parent just calls the social worker, remove them. Goes, gets a box or a bag, a garbage bag, and the child is to throw everything they own in that garbage bag and bring it to the next foster home. Well, if you treat children like that, I mean, what are we expecting from them? And so that is, and the problem with the system is not only are they being moved from home to home to home, as you've experienced and you've seen on cases, but they're dealing with social workers who get burned out very quickly, and multiple social workers, multiple different people. Nobody is consistent, and hence the CASA program.
Right. Right, and I would say that, you know, having been a social worker and having been a foster parent as well, it's really difficult. It's difficult work, for lack of a way of putting it. And, you know, I can't imagine being 22 and working on some of these cases. I mean, think about, you know, like the cases where children are so violently abused, and you know, you have a parent who has severe and persistent mental illness or who is addicted to drugs, and you're tasked to try to support that parent in trying to, you know, gain sobriety, or you're tasked in working with that child who has experienced enormous amounts of trauma, and you are the front end person to try to mend that. I mean, it's a real difficult task, and so that's why hopefully there's a team of folks around these kids that work together and share insight and share expertise and skills, because I don't think anybody can do it alone. And I think that's what's amazing about our advocates, is that these are volunteers, folks who, many of them are pretty established in the community, who have been parents themselves, who are retired educators, who are attorneys by trade or social workers by trade, or they're folks that work in marketing, who have a maturity about them and are very you know, amazing social justice advocates, child advocates, who are going to be willing to just kind of demand for these kids what they're entitled to.
Not only demand, but as you say, create consistency, because it's one CASA, one child, and even when the child is put into a permanent setting and maybe permanent foster care, the CASA will continue to stay involved with the child for the rest of the child's life, perhaps. Hopefully, that is the intent. So you have a consistent adult. The other thing is the CASA is a volunteer who puts in all this time and then can make sure all the people involved, be it educators, medical caregivers, work together. Because they're sharing information through the CASA. The CASA is the one that's doing all the legwork and the time, because the social worker who's overwhelmed and has how many cases now? I've heard they have up to 20 cases now. And the recommendation, the national standard, is 13 to 15. So, and they have 20. I mean, and these are not easy cases. So don't blame the social worker, because this is not, you know, this is quite a task. So having a volunteer who will do all the time, the legwork, and put all this together for the social worker, for the attorneys involved in the case, and for all the different players, I mean, that to me is a godsend.